Here is a story of one family's terrifying ordeal. Is it true or just a scary bedtime story? You decide. This is a pretty long story of the scariest thing that ever happened to me. I hope you guys never have an experience as bad as mine. I had moved onto a property with a house and a barn 2 miles away from a small town. The house itself was in the middle of a nicely wooded area, which was perfect for me. I love the serenity of the woods, untainted by urban life. The house was given to them by my grandparents, which is strange because we didn't live in this house growing up. In fact, my parents never mentioned it to me until I had graduated college, admitting that they much preferred city life over living in the middle of nowhere. As a child, my mother had lived in the house until she was around 7, when one day, my grandparents decided to pack up and move away. They never sold the house. They said there were too many memories, and at the very least, my parents could use it as a vacation home. They never did. The house was in a slight state of disrepair, but I couldn't care less. I was a homeowner. Mowing the lawn and clearing the branches was the easy part. The real work began within the house. I dusted off old furniture, cleared cobwebs, and threw away old canned food. It took me about 2 weeks of cleaning until I decided it was sanitary enough to move into. I decided to take a few weeks to just relax. I was tired of partying and didn't want to start searching for a job just yet. I spent my first day at the house hiking near the creek, fishing on a small pond, and meeting folks in the town. That night, however, I was restless. There was no TV and I didn't have any books other than textbooks to read. I needed something to do after it got dark out, so I explored the attic. To my surprise, it was filled with furniture and toys and trinkets from my mother's childhood. I found baseball cards, jump ropes, a little football helmet, action figures, a dollhouse, board games, etc. This was fascinating to me. I then came across an antique dresser in which I had discovered my mother's diary. Jackpot! I can read this at night until I fall asleep. There would be no reading tonight though. I was extremely tired and decided to go to sleep in my new bedroom. Sleep came fast, but later in the night, I was awoken by creaking coming from the stairs and attic. This was to be expected living in an old house, and I was sure I'd get used to it. The next day, I had decided to check out the barn. The barn, in fact, was in pristine condition, aside from a pile of cigarette butts in the corner. There also was a musky smell which hung heavy in the air. The smell was the only thing that bothered me. I'm a non-smoker and hate cigarettes. The stench they gave off makes me want to vomit. I saw there was a very unstable looking ladder leading up to the loft, which I decided not to use. The last thing I needed was to break my neck in the middle of nowhere. There didn't appear to be anything up there aside from some hay hanging over the edge. After picking up the cigarette butts, I realized that I had plenty of free time, because I thought I was going to spend the entire day cleaning the barn. I made up my mind to go into town, but then soon realized I couldn't find my car keys. I swore I had left them on the kitchen table next to my wallet. This is what I've always done with any set of car keys I own. I decided to head back to the attic. Aside from a couple new discoveries of an old mirror and a pile of old clothes, I couldn't find my keys. As I was leaving the attic, I noticed that there were less dolls than I remembered. And one doll in particular, I could have sworn was not there before. Whatever. I decided to return to the bedroom and read my mother's diary. Lying in bed, I began reading through some of my mother's entries. Several of them mentioned an older brother, James, throwing tantrums for no apparent reason, punching himself in the face, and trying to fling his baseball bat into a tree. The funny thing is, my mother must have had a very overactive imagination, as she was an only child. My stomach began rumbling, so I marked the page I was on and headed downstairs for a snack. I also was growing more annoyed by the constant creaking in the attic. I was going to head into town the next morning and find someone who could fix it. Remembering again that I had lost my keys, I decided to retrace my steps once more. The sun outside was beginning to set, looking like a dull orange peeking over the horizon. I went to check the barn before it came too dark to see and brought along a flashlight. I didn't find my keys, but I did find a few cigarette butts in the corner which I had apparently missed from earlier. I set down the flashlight, scooped them up, and threw them away. After an unsuccessful search, I glanced up towards the loft and a chill ran down my spine. I noticed a doll propped up against the wall that I could have sworn was in the attic yesterday. Against my better judgment, I climbed the rickety ladder to the loft. There was nothing up here aside from an old hammer, the doll, and a pile of hay. I picked up the doll, climbed down, and headed back to the house. When I opened the front door, to my amazement, the keys were lying right there on the ground. I picked them up and saw that the car ignition key was mangled and bent. Annoyed that somehow I must have stepped on the key and bent it, I was going to walk to town in the morning and headed for bed for an early start. But before going to sleep, I cracked open the diary once more for a little bedtime reading. My mother was surprisingly articulate for a 7-year-old. I became so entranced by her stories that the house's creaking no longer bothered me. As I kept reading, I began to notice the entries taking on a more ominous tone. James began cutting himself in front of the family and was starting fires. The stories were very troubling for a 7-year-old's imagination. In the most disturbing entry, James had tried to kill my grandfather with a knife and ran off into the woods after stabbing him, my mother in shock, bearing witness to the entire scene. After several days, my grandfather returned home from the hospital, but no one knew where James was. He hadn't come back. Shortly after, dead animals started appearing outside the front door and messages were being written on the house in blood. My mother wrote how my grandparents had been whispering among themselves and no longer allowed her out of the house alone. She wrote several times in the diary how much she missed James, and that's how the diary ended, with her lamenting over the whereabouts of James and of no mention of when or why they had chose to move. I closed the diary. My heart was racing and my pupils dilated. A very foreboding feeling washed over me. I didn't want to stay here anymore. True or not, the diary chilled me to the bone. I was now aware of everything around me due to adrenaline coursing through me. I was aware of the wind blowing outside and of every little creak that the house made. Wait, the house was no longer creaking. In fact, it was dead silent. I jumped up and pushed my bed against the door and moved the dresser in front of the window, barricading myself in the room. In my haste, I had accidentally knocked over and broke my one lamp, my only light source. The blanket of night slowly engulfed the room in complete darkness, save for the only source of light coming from the keyhole in the door. Determined to stay awake until sunrise, I sat with my back against the wall next to the bed. Then it started. The floor began creaking at the end of the hallway and continued, until it stopped, right in front of my door. The little light that was coming through the keyhole went dark. I tried to listen over the deafening sound of my panicked breathing and of the thumping of my heart. After a few minutes of soul-crushing fear, light returned through the keyhole, followed by the slowly fading sound of the creaking floor. I stayed frozen and refused to look through the keyhole to confirm my worst fears. After what seemed like days, morning finally came. When I saw the faint hint of light creeping around my dresser, I pushed it away from the window and waited till the sun saturated the entire forest. I pushed my bed away from the door and then bolted down the stairs and ran outside. I didn't need a car. I was going to run to town. Remembering my heavy mag flashlight, I ran into the barn and quickly grabbed it, to be used as a blunt weapon just in case. I plucked it up from a pile of cigarette butts it was now under and ran down the dirt road into town. I called my parents to come and pick me up from the local diner. I sat shaking in a booth, which was against a wall and not a window. I had also contacted the police about a possible intruder being in my house. After being picked up by my parents, we received a visit from the police. The police insisted that they found nothing out of the ordinary, and both my mother and grandparents denied any existence of a family member named James, that it was all in my imagination. I later returned to the house with my parents and several of my friends to help retrieve my belongings. I was not staying another night in this damned house. In the bedroom, I found a stack of blank pages on the nightstand, but couldn't find the diary anywhere, no matter how much I searched. My mother vehemently denied ever having a diary and scolded me for smoking in the barn and littering the ground with cigarette butts, and for having such an overactive imagination. I lived in a hotel for a while after the ordeal. After several days passed, I decided to drop by my parents' house. I walked in on my mother and my grandparents having an explosive argument, while my father sat silently with a blank stare and gaping mouth. The heated argument obviously ceased the second I walked into the room, and they muttered something about the topic being on politics. Not long after this incident, my mother admitted herself into a mental health hospital for a few weeks. She seemed different after her stay at the hospital, but it was probably due to the heavy medication that they had her on. She still sees a doctor for anxiety problems. Recently, my parents moved to New York. My mom prefers areas crowded with people. My family and I don't talk about what happened anymore. The way I see it, there are only 3 possibilities of what happened during my stay. The first is that I went psychotic, bent my own keys, smoked all of the cigarettes, and moved the dolls around. Then after a few days of my psychotic break, I decided to run into town and make up a story about what happened. I don't believe any of this happened at all, although I'd like to believe this one the most. Second is that some ghost or spirit was trying to tell me its story. I don't really believe this one at all either. I mean, a ghost smoking cigarettes? I don't really believe in the supernatural, but I sure do believe in deranged maniacs. The third and final one is that James really did exist and was living on the property. It was James who bent my keys and smoked cigarettes. It was he who walked down the hall and looked into my room through the keyhole. I figured my grandparents believed him to be gone when they gave me the house. I assumed that what happened scarred my mother for life, and she no longer talks about it. I believe this one 100%, but I refuse to go back to the house to confirm it. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed. Until next time.